This is a little bit more of a more serious story than something we usually cover, but I think it's something we should talk to people about on the show. I think human trafficking is obviously a complicated and terrible subject. There's a lot of victims, and I think it's important for you to come here and tell people about the great work you're doing. So I usually sit here with a pile of questions, but I think with this one, I just want you to tell your story, and then we'll dig into it. Just give the background on how this became a subject you wanted to work on.
Yeah, I knew virtually nothing about human trafficking really until graduate school, and began to travel, especially in the developing world, with some other students and friends. And in my case, the first case I came across was a case involving a 12-year-old girl who was from a very poor family. Her family sends her to the big city for the summer to get a job where she could earn some money that she could bring home to the family. And so she gets a job in a restaurant washing dishes and earns some summer money, and then is getting ready to head back home to her family. And to do that, she's got to catch a train from Victoria Station in Mumbai, which is a very, very crowded train station. I think something like 1 million people a day are going through this station. And she's just kind of confused by the chaos. She can't find her train. A couple of older ladies see her struggling and approach her and say, "Hey, are you doing okay?" And she says, "Well, I can't find my train." They say, "Well, where are you going?" And she tells them, and they said, "Oh, well, we know where that is. That's actually on the same line that we're on. We'll show you." And so she's kind of relieved to have these ladies looking out for her. And so she hops on the train. They start chatting. They have some tea. And it turns out the tea is drugged. And so she's knocked out cold. And when she wakes up, she finds herself on the third floor of a brothel in the red light district, where she's been sold for the equivalent of 250 American dollars. And from that point forward, the trafficker tells her, "You're now going to service the customers at the brothel." And she says, "I just want to go home." And he says, "That's not really an option for you anymore. I paid good money for you. You're now going to make money for me." And he sets a quota. She has to service 7 to 12 men a day, 7 days a week.
At 12 years old.
At 12. And meanwhile, here's her family at the rural train station who has no idea where she is. They don't know why she's not on the train. And they don't even know how to start looking for her. And, as I learned about that story, it made my blood boil. I thought, how do you do that to a 12-year-old?
How did you come across the story, though?
A friend of mine had started an organization that was starting to look proactively for these kinds of cases. And it was through him that I learned about this story. And it just, you hear a story like that and you feel like, in a world of moral gray, there's a lot of moral gray, there's a lot of nuance. This is pretty black and white. And it's pretty clear to me that 12-year-old shouldn't be there. And so there was a big part of me that was like, whatever it takes, we have to get her out right now. You can't let that continue. And then you start to learn about the scope of the problem, and you hear, oh, there's 25 million people who are in that same position today. And all of a sudden, it's like your soul is divided into two parts. One part is going, get her out now. The other part is going, wait a second, you can't get too close to this, because 25 million victims, like whatever they do, it's just going to be a drop in the ocean. It's not really going to make a difference. It's like getting too close to a fire that you can't put out. You got to back away. You're going to get burned. And I think as long as you're in that position, it's a very painful position to be in, to feel like there's something that's horrible that's happening that has to be stopped. And at the same time, I don't feel that there's anything I feel very powerless and feel like there's nothing that I can meaningfully do to put a dent in it. And that is just a very painful position to be in. And for whatever reason, for me, I felt this, really probably for the only time in my life, this clear sense of like, hey, I think this is what I'm supposed to do. And I thought, well, maybe it's just an emotional high and it'll go away. And it just never did. So at that point, it changed the course of my life. I was at that time in a graduate program in the UK at Oxford, and left that early to go to law school, really with the idea of being involved in this type of work. So eventually, after clerking for a judge and being in the private sector for a number of years, moved to DC in 2007 to join the U.S. Department of Justice, which was just forming its first ever human trafficking prosecution unit. So this was the first group of federal prosecutors that would focus exclusively on human trafficking. And for almost a decade, that was my job. I'd get up on a Monday morning, travel around the country, work with a team of federal agents, FBI agents, Homeland Security agents, and we just started working these cases from start to finish. And
domestic or international?
There were cases where the victims were here. Some of the victims were from other countries but ended up here, and a lot of the victims were domestic. And actually, that was something that was quite surprising to me. I think a lot of the news stories and maybe movies you see would make you think, and even the name itself, trafficking, sounds like it's about movement. It sounds like it's about crossing borders. And yet, the vast majority of victims never cross a border of any kind. And really, I learned that that's because traffickers are really in it to make money. It's an economic crime, it's a cost benefit crime. And so they kind of think of it like a business model. So if you're a trafficker, you're thinking, hey, I want to make money. Maybe I'll do that through commercial sex, which we call sex trafficking. Maybe I'll do it through some other industry, a hotel, a restaurant, a brick kiln. But either way, I need laborers to do it. And I've got a fundamental choice. I could either use voluntary laborers, so I got to pay some kind of competitive wage to and keep them happy, or they'll go somewhere else. Or I could use force and threats and violence, coerce them to work for me and prevent them from leaving. Well, as long as there's no real consequence for that, then all my labor costs magically get turned into profits. So I'm just going to make more money. And so that's why when we look at sort of the global landscape, what we see is that trafficking just explodes in places where the laws are not enforced. It doesn't really matter for the traffickers whether there's laws in the books as long as those laws are not enforced.
So it sounds like slavery is essentially a component of trafficking.
Yeah, and there's debates about what the right terminology
Yeah.
is, but yeah, I think there's a large group that calls this modern slavery, and really at the heart of the crime, it really is about overcoming the will of another person. It's about taking away their freedom to make choices about where they work, what they do, who touches their body, and so fundamentally, it really is about control of another person and robbing them of their freedom.
Yeah, so the traditional kind of cases I've heard about is Eastern European girls being moved across Europe for sex work, maybe South Americans being moved, again, traditionally for sex work, occasional cases of children. I've heard a number of cases with regards to India. Can you just give me an idea of the range of cases and who it affects? Is it mainly women and children? Or is there a surprising number of adult men who are trafficked? What's the range we're dealing with here?
Yeah, so if you think of human trafficking as the umbrella term, and you think of the two buckets within that as sex trafficking and labor trafficking, about 20% of the world's victims are sex trafficking victims.
Okay.
The other 80% are labor. And really, that's not surprising if you think about it, because really it's the same business model. What we've done is really just take one specific type of behavior, which is commercial sex, and say we're going to isolate that specific industry, so to speak, and we're going to call that sex trafficking. And then every other, arena, we're going to call labor trafficking. So that includes every other type of industry, from agriculture to domestic servitude to, hotels or restaurants. Everything else gets called labor trafficking. So on the sex trafficking side, the evidence is that it's the victims are overwhelmingly female. On the labor trafficking side, it's a more even split. Now, even on the sex trafficking side, there are non-female victims. There are boys, and there are others who are targeted for sex trafficking. But on the labor trafficking side, it tends to be a more even split. In terms of geographic distribution, this is one of the shockers for me. When I was at the Justice Department, I had an opportunity to take a sabbatical and work on a book that I wrote with a friend of mine called "The Locust Effect: Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence." And in that book, we looked at the global landscape and discovered that 93% of the world's victims are actually in developing countries, which blew my mind, because you think about that. That means that even if somehow we magically could eviscerate all trafficking in the United States and the UK and Western Europe and Australia, Japan, we'd still have 93% of the victims out there, which means we really can't impact trafficking at scale if we're not impacting traffickers in the developing world.